Hello everyone, welcome to the Ultimate API Challenge, a place where we learn, grow and work with different API and a variety of tech in order to create an end result project that hopefully can be put on your web development portfolio. Your knowledge level doesn't play the biggest role, but your willingness to learn and challenge yourself does. To find more information about different challenges and the project itself, check the website below. In this video, we will be building the famous weather app, of course using the weather API. The tech we will cover is going to be JavaScript, ES6 Classes, and getJSON, which is a native method from jQuery. We will of course face some errors and we're gonna learn how to overcome them, so let's get started. As usual, we have a link to our GitHub where we can find the starter files. You can download them through the code button as previously, and that's where we're gonna land. So we have starter files, we have a gitignore, pretty.rc, favicon or favicon, index, HTML with a lot of stuff. This is gonna be a quite intense challenge. We have the CSS with all the styling that we need and script.js. First, let's check what we're gonna build. You first land on an interface like this, enter, let's say Berlin, that's where I am. Click on search, you have a loader happening, and then you have the result. Today is Saturday, February 13th. We see here we have some hover effect, we have all this data. Let's check our API docs. Open in a new tab. API. We have weather states. This is going to be useful for us once we want to display the icons that we saw here. We're going to be using the API's icons. Then we have methods. I'm going to be using the first two methods. The way that this API is split is first you need to give it the location that you want, for example Berlin, and we're gonna get back in our response a field called where on earth ID. With this ID we can go and call our location API URL with this ID. That's how the API works and that's how we're gonna be working with it. So let's check our steps. Our step says the first one, declare a class to get weather data and get the where on earth ID, output the received data. We need to be doing two calls and then we can output the data that we're getting. Before we start coding, in software engineering or software development, web development, there is such a thing called MVC. MVC stands for Model View Controller, which is a software design pattern. Even though it is for a software as a whole, the model being the data structure, the view being the presentation of that data, and the controller being everything between, responsible for the input and the output. Now in our project, we're gonna try and use this kind of design pattern for our JavaScript file. We're gonna have a class that is responsible for outputting the data, a class that is responsible for listening to the user's input, as well as the class for fetching the data that we need. And to cover a little bit about classes, we are going to work with them even though they are not the most common thing in vanilla JavaScript, but they are worth getting to know and the methods and the ways of working with them that they offer. Plus, React.js and Vue.js do work with classes, so I think that's a pretty good thing to know, to get familiarized with before you jump to those frameworks. As mentioned, following the MVC pattern, we're going to have several classes, which we will divide per function. Not JavaScript function, but their whole kind of like area of responsibility. Shall we start? Let's declare our first class. Class is a reserved word in JavaScript. Whenever you write class, it knows that you want to create a class, and we're going to call it request controller. You open curly brackets and that's how you get a class. Our request controller is going to be our main point of input from the user. And as always, let's first make our API work with our code and see how we can proceed from there. If we check our documentation, we have our first URL that we need to call, which would be this one. How do we want to store this information? Let's first write const base API URL. It would be our API here. As you see, the /API and /API, that's what they're referring to. Put it in a string. We have location, and here we have as well location. So the base of our API is not going to change. Next, we're going to have our search query, const search API URL. This is going to equal base URL /search. I'm referring to this one here. Let's declare a method in the class called getLocation. We're calling it a method, but it's actually the same as a function, but in classes, the functions are called methods. So you can read this on MDN. It has a lot of good information. And we said we're going to use jQuery and it's getJSON. All the links to the documentation you can find on the website of the challenge under the section links. So we have getJSON. What is it? Load JSON encoded data from the server using a getHTTP request. So we have a URL that we need to pass, data, and success, which is callback function. We're going to cover callbacks a little bit later. Just know that it's a function. We have simple example here, getJSON, and then we have .done, $.getJSON. I have included already jQuery in the HTML as a link. We're going to call the base API URL. We need to pass something. We have a query. So for now, let's just pass as a string Berlin, and then we had .done, use an arrow function, and console.log data. Save it. You see I suddenly have all the semicolons because that's what prettier does for me. Let's open the console, right click on the mouse, inspect, and here we go, console. So if we're going to refresh it, get location, we need to call it. In order to call anything on a class, first you need to initialize it, const request. You need to write new in order to create a new instance of that class, a request controller, and you need to call it. Then you can do request.getLocation and call that function. Now let's save it, refresh. Access to XML HTTP request from origin null has been blocked by CORS policy. So what is CORS? CORS is an abbreviation for cross-origin resource sharing, and this error originates from a modern browser's policies that is called same origin policy, or SOP, which basically blocks responses from APIs that don't have the same domain. The origin of them is not the same. For example, we're doing it now from our local machine and we're trying to access meta weather. They're not the same. That's why the browser blocks it. Of course, we have something to bypass this error. There was a thing called CORS Anywhere, which was created by Rob Wu, but as of February 2021, they had to shut down this service, but they were very kind to keep the code alive and everybody can create their own server, which is going to allow them to bypass this kind of like CORS issues. And that's what I created. I already have the code prepared, so you don't really need to type it. It's in the challenges website under the section hints, and it's hint number 2. I copied it, and that's what I'm going to add now. I'm not going to go very into detail here. We're basically creating here a method, and we're using another method from jQuery, which is Ajax pre-filter, that is going to pre-filter every request that getJSON does. Let's call add course header in here before the getJSON request. And the way that we do it is by using the keyword this. This refers to everything that is between those curly brackets. You're gonna see that we're gonna be using a lot of this, and if you're a little bit uncomfortable with that yet, that's fine. Just go with it. So this.add course header, we're gonna call it here. Then straight away we're gonna do the getJSON. Let's check if that one works now. I need to refresh, not found. Let's click here. We can always investigate what is happening. This is our request URL. We have our course URL, and then we have the metaweather.com API/location $Berlin. Okay, that's not what we have in documentation. We have location/search. Did we do location./search? Yeah, we're not using the right one. We need to use the search API URL, but $Berlin, but we need to do $query equals Berlin. How you can do that is by passing an object where we did Berlin. You can do query, colon, and then Berlin. And that should kind of do the magic by itself. Or maybe not, let's see. Yes, we have title. Let's just check for real quick what we did here. Our course header, then we have our API search URL location/search, and then $query is Berlin. And that's what we were missing. We were missing an object with the key query, and then we can define the query, and jQuery does it on our behalf by adding the syntax that is needed for the request URL. Now let's check what we're getting. We're getting title Berlin, location type city, where on Earth ID, and that is what we're going to extract in order to go to our next call. Let's create another method, get weather data, which is going to accept the location that we're going to send from our previous API call. The syntax is exactly the same. getJSON this time is going to be API/location, which is our base URL. We're going to construct it base URL/location. This is how we have it here, and then done, and we're going to console log data. Before that, we also need to call this function in our previous method, this.get weather data. So as data was an array, which means data square brackets, because we want to access the first element, which is 0 index dot where on Earth ID. Let's check it out if that one works now. Data is not defined. Oh, of course. Data. Whoa, here's your weather. Cool. Title Berlin. Consolidated weather. Looks about right for our weather. We got those things to work. Our first step was to declare a class to get weather data and get where on earth ID and output the received data. So we got that one working. Now that we got it all to work, let's rearrange it a little bit to be more appropriate for our class functionality syntax. And also remember we said that we want to do the MVC design pattern. Let's do that. What we have now in the request controller is mostly our fetching functionality. Let's go ahead and create a class, fetch forecast API. We can put all of this functionality in there like so. Those two const variables, you probably don't want to have them just hanging somewhere in a global scope somewhere. So I would suggest to putting them into a thing called constructor, which is essentially just a special function that is being called every time you initialize a new class. Think of it as a place where you save or put the information that you need throughout the class. There are many more benefits to that. There is a great article I linked in the links section on the challenges website. I highly recommend you to read that one because that one kind of like broadens your horizons when it comes to classes and what's their functionality. So give that one a read. Let's put our base API URL and search API URL up here. This dot, we're declaring that in this scope we want to be using it, and it's going to be available to us if we call it this dot base API URL. Can do the same with the search API URL. This dot here, we're going to be using this dot base API URL, referring to the one above. Let's remove them, adjust our API URLs where we used to have it as const variable. The constructor is not only a place where you only store data, you can actually call methods that are going to be called once your class is being initialized. I would suggest we move the add course header to the constructor. We want to call it straight away before we have any other API calls being done. We have now a dedicated class that is only for fetching the forecast API. What we are missing though is that here we have initialization of our request controller, but the request controller have no information about the fetch forecast API. So we need to connect those two. Using the constructor, we can initialize classes within classes. This dot fetch forecast API, new fetch forecast API. So it is very similar to what we did here below, but now we're just doing it in the constructor, so we have access to it in our class. And let's maybe create a method here in it, this dot fetch forecast API dot get location, and that's how we're going to call it. And from here we can do the this dot init. Now when we initialize, we don't need to call it specifically here, but we can just do it like this. Refresh. Yep, it works. Cool. Register an event listener and attach it to the get request chain from above, adjust UI loading state. And that's, you guessed it, creating another class that is going to help us work with UI elements. It's going to make it easier a little bit, even though it doesn't sound like that. We're going to create class core DOM elements, and this class is going to be responsible for storing all the elements that we have in HTML in their respective variables. In order not to spend too much time on it, you can grab that snippet from the finished result on GitHub. We have the search form, we have an error box search box. Let me show you. This one is the search box. Every card have its own dedicated ID. Then we have the load box and the forecast box. I chose only those elements because those are the ones that are core in terms of interaction and that we need to be using them more than once. Also, in order not to spend much time on writing it, feel free to copy the whole class core DOM elements with its methods because I'm not gonna focus on that one. I did focus on hiding, showing loading states and error states in the two previous challenges, which I'm gonna link. You can go a little bit step by step there. Here we're not going to be focusing on that. Here we go. Show forecast, show loader, hide loader, show search, hide search, show error, hide error. It's very basic just to have our interaction ready for us. Now we need to initialize it. It would be better if we do it in the request controller, even though we can do it everywhere. This dot core DOM elements equals new core DOM elements. Good, we got that covered. I'm going to close this here for now. Back to our steps. Register an event listener and attach it to the get request chain from above and adjust UI loading state. So register an event listener. We're going to do it in the request controller because that's our main source of input interaction with the user. Register event listener. Event listener that we're going to register is a submit because this one is a form, and the way that form works is that if you click on the button here, which is inside of the form, it's going to trigger a submit event, and if you press enter, it's also going to trigger a submit event. So we kind of got it covered here with those two use cases. In the core DOM DOM elements, we have search form, and we can access it through this core DOM elements search form on. This is a jQuery event listener. It's not the regular JavaScript add event listener. So search form on, submit, and then we can define a function, pass the event. The things with forms is that the native behavior refreshes the page once you click on enter. In order to prevent that, there is a method on the event called prevent default. You can see the submit here. If I write L, press enter, you see it did a reload. We want to avoid that because we don't want to refresh our page. We want to keep the page as is and just continue showing data that we want to show. We can create another function that is going to be this on submit. I keep on saying functions, but I mean methods. Let's declare the method that we just called below. Extract the value that we have here. Let's say if I write London, then I want this London to appear in my onSubmit. So I know that it has an ID search query. So $# search query. If I want to access the value of it, I just do .val. I want only this value. If somebody is going to do spaces, there is a method called .trim, which trims all the white spaces. Const query equals this one, and then just like console log it query. You don't need to put it in curly brackets. It's just a matter of habit of mind. Instead of the init, call the register event listener. So this way, as soon as the instance is being created, we're gonna register the event listener along with it. And once the user interacts with our form, then it's gonna prevent the default. Let's check London. Yeah, submit. We have here the console log, so we can remove that. And next, what we're gonna do with the query is we're gonna try and send it to the get location. This fetch forecast API get location query. With the get location, we need to accept the query. We have query hard-coded to Berlin, but we want to use this query that is incoming. We can write query, or because of ES6 syntax, we can just shorten it and it will be the same as query column query. Now let's check that this thing works. Yeah, here's your weather. Let's try London. See? Cool. Title, London. Awesome. Now we need to adjust UI loading state. Don't need the init. Okay, one more thing that we could do, check there is actually a query to search for. Create a new function called getQuery, which is going to be responsible for giving us the query from this input field. And we're going to return it. We're going to use it here. We're going to do this getQuery. Anything that the getQuery is going to return is going to be stored in the query. If there is no query, then return. If there is, we're going to proceed and we're going to fetch the location as well as show some loading states here. In the core DOM elements, we have a show loader function as well as hide search box. And those are the two functions that we're going to be calling. This core DOM elements show loader, and then this core DOM elements hide search box. Now we should see that Berlin, here's our loader. We can put these two into their own respective function. Show request in progress. You could also just left it. It's a matter of preference, habits. Double check that it works. Berlin search loader is being shown, data is being fetched. All right. We have the request controller registering the event, then it's having an onSubmit method, and we have show request in progress and get location. Get location is being called in fetch forecast API, and then it is calling. So you see what I mean? There is a lot of chains of this happens, then this, then this, then this, then this, and that's kind of gets messy. To avoid that, we should call the get location, retrieve the data that we're getting from it in the request controller, and then from the request controller call the get weather data, get something back, and then the request controller decides where that data goes further. This way we're keeping it kind of separate. Our fetch forecast API class should be only responsible for fetching things and returning things. It should not be interacting with another class on top of that to display the data or maybe prepare the data. Let's create another function called fetch weather, and this fetch weather has the query to it. In the fetch weather, we're gonna have our query and we're gonna be calling the get location. We want to receive the data that we're getting from the get location back in our fetch weather. The way that we can do that is by having such a thing called callback. The concept of callback can also require some time to grasp it. Don't worry if it's not settling in, everything takes time. Just code along, hopefully one day things are gonna click. So this fetch forecast API get location query, and then we're gonna pass a function. Let me show you. data, console.log data. And now let's call this callback from the get location. So usually if you pass an argument as a function which is being called back, basically it's being called after something is done, then you're only calling that function. It's kind of being called back. Name it callback. And then when it's done, instead of this get weather data API, callback and data. This means that the data we have here is going to be passed in here. Got it? We're passing a function that is accepting an argument. We're passing it here. We're calling it and passing the data that we got from the API. Now we can access it here. Might be confusing, keep on doing it and you'll see how it works. So once we have the data, we needed to access the data 0.whereOnEarthID. Comment that, this.fetch forecast API.get weather data. And we're gonna pass to it this value. We want this data to be returned to us to this function. So we're doing exactly the same, passing a function to the get weather data. And let's just console log things here. In order to console log this data, we would need to have it here. Okay, this might be confusing with all the datas here. Let's call it for now response and here. This way we know clearly that data is data here and response here. We need to pass here the callback that we just passed. Callback. Let's see if it's gonna work. We're supposed to see fetch weather and response. Berlin, search. Yeah, okay, cool. This, you can continue nesting more and more functions, callbacks and so on and so forth. Usually it's called or the Christmas tree because it has like this triangular shape, or it can also be called the callback hell. While this is not the most elegant solution, it might happen that you come across this kind of code, so it's good if you know about it. Let's also cover fail scenarios, because we're not always going to receive the response. So in getJSON, there is also such a thing called failed. We're going to be passing to our callback, if it failed, a null. We're going to copy this and we're going to handle it exactly the same way. Let's go back to our callback hell. In the first callback, so what is it sending us? It's basically sending us a location, right? We're fetching the location. Let's call it location and here location. If we're sending null and JavaScript is going to try and access the 0 index of the null array, it's going to error. We should check if null location or location.length is 0, then we have a method in the core DOM elements, show error, and we can pass a message to it. Could not find this location, please try again. And what the show error is going to do, it's going to hide the loader, show the search again, show the errors, and insert the message you want to display to the user. And we want to return. We don't want to proceed with the next call. That's where we get to this callback. We ensure that we have location and location array bigger than 0. We're going to have at least one entry in it. And the API guarantees us that we're going to have whereOnEarthID. This response, we also want to check if we have the data that we need there. So rename it back to data. If no data, then we're going to do same like here, but we can write could not proceed with the request, please try again later, and return out of it. If we do have the data that we need, we would like to call our next step. Let's again console log to double check that everything works. Berlin, search. We are here. Now let's console log the data that we're getting to understand what we're going to be working with. So this is all the data that we need for our next step, which is prepare the data for the UI in advance and try to use a unified structure before outputting to the template. This step is the one where we're going to do some data manipulation, preparing data, trying to make it as easy as possible for our UI to display that data. So what do I mean by that? If we check our prepared weather forecast, let's focus on this part here where we have predictability, humidity, wind, and all the other properties. What's common among them is that they have a title, a value, and a unit. So in case of predictability, the title is predictability, then the value is 71, and the unit is percentage. Sometimes the data that we fetch from an API is not necessarily given to us in the same way that we want to display it, or it's not what our UI expects. And I'm going to show you how we can adapt a little bit our data before outputting it. We have here 3 parts: main data about today, then some more details, and then the forecast. We already started with this part. Let's go with it. Left off here. Now the data that we're receiving, we need to pass on. As you probably guessed it, we are going to create another class. Class data middleware. Let's create a method prepare data for DOM, which is going to receive data. We're gonna call it here. But before we call it, we need to initialize it. Here we can use it as this data middleware prepare data for DOM and send on the data that we have in case of successful response. Now in the prepare data for DOM, we're going to prepare the data per section. We have this section, and this section. Those are 3 sections, and they're gonna have their respective objects or array that contain the needed data for the UI. And then we're gonna have another class for actually displaying the data. And let's see how it goes. First, let's focus on this part. From what we see here, it's gonna be an object or an array where we're gonna have title, value, and unit. First, let's extract the data that we know we will need for this section from the data that is being sent to us from the API. We can check that. Let's console log it here. Refresh. Okay. Gonna be in consolidated weather, yeah, for our date for this one, data.consolidated weather. So gonna copy it, and we're going to take the first element of the array, 0. We have in here all those properties, and we're going to deconstruct them. Which properties do we need? Let's go back here. We need predictability, humidity, wind, air pressure, and temp. Predictability is here. Humidity, wind, it's wind speed, air pressure, max temp, and min temp. You might have noticed that some of the values here, for example, wind speed is a much bigger integer than what we're displaying here, and that's something that we will also need to take care of before we show it to the UI. Now we have those values, and we need to construct an object from them. How would I usually go about it? I would create a separate function, gather today's forecast details, and what this function is going to do is only going to return an object, and the object is going to be consistent of these things that we wrote here with title, value, and unit. So eventually, when we have that, we could just loop over this object, extract the title, the value, and the unit. The styling for all of those elements is going to be the same. You know what I mean? So if I inspect it, this is the parent, and those children, they're all alike. They all have a span and a span, and here a span and a span, and it's always the same. We need the title, predictability, which is going to have a value and a unit. The value of it is going to be predictability. Let's pass it this dot gather today's forecast details. We're going to pass one argument, but in a form of an object. This way we don't need to care about the order of the arguments. We can just say something dot predictability, and that's what we want. We know that we're going to need all of them. That's why we extracted them. Let's just put them here. Here we're going to accept them as data, and our value is going to be data dot predictability. You see what I meant? The unit for this one is percentage, as we see in the UI right here. Next is humidity, data.humidity, and the value is also percentage. Air pressure, and because air pressure has a space in it, we would need to wrap it in a string in order for it to be a valid key. Air pressure, data.air pressure. What's the unit? Oh, sorry, we jumped one. A unit is MB, I don't know what that is. And we forgot wind, which doesn't need to be in a string. Data.wind speed, value is kilometers per hour. 2 last ones, max temperature and min temperature. Max temp, Celsius, and min temp. Okay, we saw that some of the values need to be rounded. For example, wind speed. So we can wrap it in parentheses and write math.round, and we had it somewhere else. The temps can be rounded. Temp here and temp here. Anything else? Max temp, min temp, predictability. Okay, now since we're returning from this function, let's store it in today's forecast details, and let's console log. Let's see if that one works. Berlin, yay! You see they're already rounded. And how are we going to display it in the UI? Create a method, show today's forecast details. Call it from here, this dot show today's forecast details, and we're going to pass our new variable, which is today's forecast details. Show today forecast details, forecast, and we're going to use a jQuery loop just for the sake of it. Since we're already doing jQuery, then why not? $.each, define what we're looping over, forecast, and I think with the each you can loop over an object and an array. jQuery isn't really picky about it. Then you have an argument, which in inside you can have the key and the value. And let's open our loop. The template I have already prepared. Feel free to stop the video and type it. We have a div, which we saw here, our parent for those keys and values. A span where we have the key to uppercase, and then we have a value and a unit. Let's see if that works. We didn't remove the loader. Let me see if I can remove it now. There we go. To me, it looks like this function is doing too much because it's doing a loop as well as the templating. What we can do, create our new class, display forecast. Let's declare it up here. And show today's forecast details. I'm going to receive the forecast. Let's put the part of the template here, this one. See how here we do key dot to uppercase? This is something that we can do in the previous function. Our previous function was this one, and now this one is not going to be a show, this one is going to be a prepare today's forecast details, and we're doing the same loop, but this time we're going to pass exactly the values that it expects. A title, a value, and a unit. First, we created the class. We need to initialize it. Now we can call it from here, display forecast, and we're gonna pass an object. Let's say its name is going to be key dot to uppercase. Then we say we have a value, which is value dot value, and unit, value dot unit. Now we need to adjust data here. We can straight away already deconstruct it in the argument. Name, value, and unit. And here, name, value, and unit. Let's remove the loader so we don't need to manipulate it ourselves. Similar to what we had before, we can do hide loader, show forecast. The reason why I'm putting it after we are doing the show, well, we're not doing the show anymore. It's called prepare. Why I'm doing it after, because first I want the loop to happen, the preparation of the data to happen, display it to the UI. I mean, put it in the UI, but not display it yet, and only then display it. And that's why the order is like this. So let's see if this one works. Do we have a console error? Yes, display forecast is not a function. Oh, dot, like this. Refresh, Berlin, hide loader undefined. Yes, we didn't initialize it here. We can copy it from below because the syntax is exactly the same. And maybe now it would work. Yeah, cool. Okay, so we have done this part. Now we have here a forecast. Why don't we do this one? So the process is kind of going to be the same. We're going to prepare the data, loop over it, and then send it to another function or method that is going to display it. Let's again console log data. We could also go to the documentation, but sometimes I prefer to just dig into data I'm receiving and then go from there, which sometimes can be not a good idea if there are some important remarks in the documentation. But in this case, I think we're fine. Let's console log it. Data. So since we're not going to be using the first one, because we're going to be using every entry that we have in the array, let's just create another function then. Prepare upcoming days forecast. And here we're going to receive forecast, and up here we're going to call it, and what we're going to pass will be data dot consolidated weather. And in the preparation, console log our data. Berlin. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The first one would be today's. We want to display it here, so we don't need to display it in the upcoming one. Now, in order to know what we want to prepare, we should check what's going to be our template. Create a method, show upcoming days forecast. And again, feel free to stop the video and type this, or it's also in the finished result in GitHub. Here we have forecast details week, a list element, and that's why there is an li here. Classes for styling, we have an image, which is this icon, an image URL and an image URL. This bit is in order not to repeat the API's address, put it in a variable, put it here, constructor, this dot image URL. And if we go to the documentation, here are the icons, and you can have an SVG, ICO, PNG, and the way that you're accessing them is by having this abbreviation. This abbreviation comes from weather state abbreviation. If we inspect this icon, it's going to be metaweather.com/static/image weather and then LC. This is the URL that we want to build. The image URL is going to be everything up to static. because you see here you have static / image. We could actually also include the image and the weather. Let's copy link address, paste it here, and we're going to remove everything after here. All of our images are going to be prepended with this URL. We can remove that because we put it in the variable. The only thing for the image that we need to pass is the day image URL. Then we need to pass the weekday and the max temperature. Let's also then deconstruct them here. Day image URL, weekday, max temp. Now we know that this is what our UI is going to be expecting, and in here we can put it as a reference and comment it. So in our forecast, we know that we have max temperature. The weekday we don't have, we have the date, and the weather state abbreviation is going to be our day image URL. First things first, we have a forecast, that's an array, and let's start a loop. $.h forecast. Then we have index and a value. This is an array, so the loop is slightly different. On the first place, instead of a key as we had with the object, now we're receiving the index, and the value is always the second one. Remember we mentioned the 0 we don't want, so we can check if index is smaller than 1 or equals 0, then return. We don't want to do anything with the first day. Else, let's use these variables that we have here. Const day image URL is going to be value dot weather state abbreviation, then const max temp going to equal to max temp, and we're going to do a math round on it, value dot max temp, and then we come to the const weekday. We don't have the weekday, but we have the date. We can use one thing called moment.js. Library that helps us formatting dates. It's already included in the project, so you can just use it. And the way you use it, you write moment, then you pass the value that you want to use, value.applicable date. Then you write .format. We want the day, but we don't want the full day, only the first 3 letters of the day. We need to substring 0,3. The next step would be passing this data to our method. This .displayForecast .show upcoming forecast. Pass the day image URL, weekday, and the max temp. You can remove the console log here. Let's refresh. Berlin. Woohoo! Look at these. Awesome. Now we have left this part, today's weather. So the chain is kind of the same, except that we're not going to be looping over anything because we have only one day. We don't need to loop over it. So let's maybe first create the display function. Show today's forecast. You can stop the video and type it, or you can copy it from the finished result project on GitHub. Okay, so what we have here, let's open the finished result. Current weekday, today's full date, location name, image URL, today's temperature, and the weather state. And we see that we're passing a forecast. Copy these ones, the actual values. Let's create prepare today's forecast, and those are the values that we need. Comment them. So we're going to be using again the first element of the array, and we need to extend the deconstruct that we had here. Let's console log it again. So consolidated 0, put it at the end of it all. We need applicable date, the temp, weather state abbreviation, weather state name. I think this is all. Okay, looks like we have it all. Let's create another gather. Gather today's forecast general have data, and it's going to return these things that we had here. We need to call this gather data. Let's do it above. Const today's forecast general equals this dot gather data, and we're gonna pass applicable date, weather state abbreviation, weather state name, the temp, and the title is going to be data.title. And the reason why it's data.title is because we're not accessing it from the consolidated weather, we're accessing it directly on the data object. Let's remove the console log. So current weekday is going to be data.applicable date. Then today's full date is also going to be data.applicable date, but I'll show you what we're going to change with moment. Location name is data.title. Today's image URL is data.weather state abbreviation. Today's temperature is is data.thetemp, and weather state is data.weather state name. Now, what we wanted to do with moment, we wanted to show the current weekday. Format is DDD, and then this one is also going to be wrapped in parentheses because we're going to call moment, and we're going to extract the full date basically. And you're doing that by defining another format. It's going to be month, 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 and do. This is in the documentation of moment. Then today's temperature, we also had a math.round on most of our temperatures, so we're going to do it the same here. Title weather, the rest seem quite okay to me. So let's call this dot prepare today's forecast general, and we're going to pass today's forecast general. But actually, since we don't need to loop over it, we can directly call show today's forecast. This dot show today's forecast, but it's not here, it's in display forecast. And then we can remove this function. Let's see if that works. No? What happened to our little icon? Oh, I mixed it with the previous one that we had. We can do like this dot image URL slash dot svg. Yay! Awesome! So cool. Let's try with another city. London. Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo. Awesome. Whoa, what a challenge. I think we've covered everything. I know this challenge was a bit of a back and forth with declaring the methods, going here and there, up and down, and methods flying around, variables, const, this, but you have survived. Well done. Let's recap what we have done. We have majorly changed the data that we're receiving in order for our UI to be able to look as it is right now. We worked with classes, with jQuery, with callbacks. We bumped into course and we learned how to bypass it. Learned about this, about initialization of classes. I hope I'm saying that right. This was one of my favorite challenges because I have done this challenge before searching for my first job as a web developer. So for me, it holds a special place in my heart, and I've actually used even the same API, but just not the same interface. I hope you have enjoyed this. Please let me know in the comments if you did or if you struggled with something. Also remember that struggling is completely normal. It's very much so part of the journey. Sometimes things take time to click. They will eventually click. You just need to keep on practicing, keep on doing challenges, and just trust the process. All right. That was all from me. I hope you're gonna have a good rest of your day, evening, morning, wherever you are. Keep safe and see you in the next one. Bye!